Night shifts had always been my least favorite. The hospital was quieter, sure, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of quiet that felt like something was just waiting to happen. On this particular night, I was halfway through my rounds, fighting sleep, and heading into room 214 for Mr. Peterson's vitals. Mr. Peterson was an 86-year-old man with late-stage dementia. He rarely spoke in complete sentences, and usually didn't even seem aware of where he was. I'd checked on him dozens of times, and it was always the same. Him staring at the ceiling, muttering nonsense, or sound asleep. I expected nothing different tonight. I pushed the door open, clipboard in hand, and froze. He was sitting upright in bed, his back straight as a rod, staring directly at the door. At me. His eyes, sharp and clear, locked onto mine. And for a second, I forgot to breathe. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but steady. I hesitated. This was unusual. "Mr. Peterson? Are you feeling all right?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer right away. His gaze didn't waver as he muttered, They told me your name." That stopped me. My name tag was flipped backward, and I hadn't introduced myself to him. Not once. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to act normal. "What do you mean, Mr. Peterson? Who told you?" "Them," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They know you, Daniel. They're coming for you." My mouth went dry. It was probably just a coincidence, I told myself. Patients with dementia say strange things all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I walked to his bedside, hoping to calm him down. "It's okay, Mr. Peterson. Let me just check your vitals, and then you can rest." Before I could reach him, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was ice cold and far stronger than it should have been. I tried to pull away, but he held tight, his fingers digging into my skin. "You can't hide from them," he hissed, leaning closer. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his lips twisted into a chilling smile. "They see everything." "Let go, Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice shaking. I tugged at my arm, but his grip only tightened. Then, as suddenly as he had grabbed me, his body went rigid. The heart monitor beside him let out a sharp, piercing beep, and I watched in horror as his eyes rolled back into his head. He collapsed onto the bed, his hand falling limp. "Code blue, room 214, I shouted, hitting the emergency button. Nurses and doctors flooded into the room, but I barely registered them. I backed into the corner, clutching my wrist, my heart racing. They worked on him for what felt like an eternity. But it was no use. Mr. Peterson was gone. I stayed in the room after everyone else left, staring at the bed. His words echoed in my head, over and over. "They know you. They're coming for you." I rubbed my wrist, where faint red marks were already forming. They looked like scratches, like he dug his nails into me. I finally forced myself to leave the room and head to the break room. I needed to sit down to clear my head. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I glanced around the empty room. Nothing. I sat down, staring at my wrist. The red marks seemed darker now, almost like they were burned into my skin. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I didn't believe it. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft, I almost missed it. "Daniel." I froze, my blood running cold. The break room door was closed, and I was the only one there. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the room. Nothing. No one. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Daniel." I jumped to my feet, knocking Hospitals feel like entirely different places at night. During the day, the noise, the people, the activity, it all keeps you grounded. But at night, when the halls are empty and the shadows seem to stretch farther, everything feels heavier. It was my second night shift in a row, and I was dragging my feet toward the elevator. I needed to head to the third floor to grab supplies, and while I usually took the stairs, tonight I just didn't have the energy. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the third floor, and leaned against the wall, staring at the numbers above the door as they blinked faintly. The elevator doors were about to close when it happened. A scream. Loud, piercing, and full of terror. It was so sudden that I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had come from the hallway I had just left. I quickly hit the door open button and stepped out. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. I walked a few steps, looking around, but the hallway was completely empty. No patients, no staff. Just rows of closed doors and the faint hum of the overhead lights. My skin prickled with unease, but I told myself it was probably someone in another area of the hospital. Still, the sound of that scream stayed with me as I stepped back into the elevator and let the doors close. I pressed the button for the third floor again and tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The elevator jolted slightly as it started to ascend, the hum of the motor filling the small space. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and the elevator came to a jerking halt between floors. The sudden silence was deafening. I hit the emergency button, waiting for the usual automated response, but instead, I heard something else. A faint sound, barely audible at first. Crying. It was soft, like someone sobbing far away, but it quickly grew louder, more desperate. My stomach twisted as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the intercom. It was coming from above me. I stared at the ceiling panel, my heart hammering in my chest. The crying continued, punctuated by faint scratching sounds, like nails dragging across metal. I wanted to hit the emergency button again, to do something, but my hands wouldn't move. Then, the crying stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I felt trapped, like the air in the elevator was growing heavier with each passing second. Just as I started to take a shaky step back, a voice whispered from above, "Why didn't you help me?" My blood turned to ice. The voice was raspy, almost guttural, and so close that it felt like it was right in my ear. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the wall. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, pressed against the ceiling panel. It stared down at me, its mouth twisting into a silent scream before the lights came back on. I slammed the emergency button repeatedly, my breathing ragged. The elevator shuddered and began to move again, the light stabilizing as it climbed to the third floor. When the doors finally opened, I bolted out, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The hallway was brightly lit and empty, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, before realizing I still needed the supplies. The thought of stepping back into that elevator made me nauseous, so I took the stairs back down, my steps hurried and uneven. For the rest of the shift, I avoided the elevators entirely. Even when my coworkers asked why, I didn't have an answer I could give. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital as fast as I could. But as I walked to my car, the sensation of being watched returned. I glanced over my shoulder, but the parking lot was empty. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized my hands were still shaking. The image of that face, staring down at me, was burned into my mind. I tried to tell myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but what it felt like. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that elevator wasn't done with me yet. It was halfway through my shift when the call came through my walkie. "Daniel, we need you to check on room 305. The patient is restless." I paused mid-step, frowning. Room 305 hadn't been in use for weeks. The last patient in that room had been discharged, and no one had mentioned admitting anyone new. I pressed the button on my walkie. "Are you sure about that?" 305's empty, I said. A moment of static, then, "Mrs. Grant is in there. Go check." The voice was calm, certain. I sighed, figuring there had been a late admission no one had updated me on, and started toward room 305. The hallway leading to it was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for sounds that weren't there. When I reached the door, I stopped. The lights in the room were off, but faint shadows shifted inside. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Something about this didn't feel right. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The monitors were off, and there wasn't a single piece of equipment out of place. I stared at the clipboard on the wall. Blank, just as I'd expected. I let out a slow exhale, trying to shake the unease settling over me. "Dispatch, there's no one in 305, I said into the walkie. Silence. I frowned, pressing the button again. "Did you copy that? Room 305 is empty." Static crackled through the speaker, then a faint, distorted voice replied, "No, it isn't." The air in the room seemed to shift. It felt heavier, colder. My pulse quickened as I turned back toward the bed. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed darker, like they were pressing in closer. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like footsteps. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing slightly. My rational mind told me it was just the air vents, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I took a hesitant step closer to the bed, squinting into the dim corner of the room. A figure stepped forward. It was a woman in a hospital gown, her hair matted and hanging over her face. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she was struggling to move. My breath caught in my throat as I backed up toward the door. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I managed to ask, though my voice shook. She didn't answer. She didn't even lift her head. Instead, she took another step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. The air grew colder with each step she took. "You shouldn't have left me," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, gripping the doorframe for support. Her head snapped up, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes hollow and black. "You left me here," she said again, louder this time. "I don't know you," I said, my voice rising. She took another step, and then another, until she was only a few feet away. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in her gaze. "You left me to die," she hissed, and her hand shot out toward me. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut. When I opened them, she was gone. The room was empty again. The air felt normal. The shadows in the corner were just shadows, and the faint hum of the hospital returned. I stumbled out of the room, my chest heaving, and nearly collided with a coworker. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, concern written all over her face. "There's something in there," I said, gesturing toward room 305. She gave me a puzzled look. 305. That room's closed off for maintenance." I stared at her, my blood running cold. Without another word, I turned and walked away, ignoring the tremor in my hands. That night, I avoided the south wing entirely. Even so, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me,